Alright, hello. Welcome, and today we are looking at something that is crucial for modern rhetoric, modern interchange of ideas, and modern debate on philosophy of religion, and that is this blight upon the philosophical movement known as New Atheism. Oh boy, see, this is something I didn't feel like really in a lot of ways there needs to be a video on. There's plenty of videos out there, and anybody who's ever read anything in philosophy or has a basic understanding of philosophy doesn't need another video on on New Atheism, because anybody knowledgeable about philosophy of religion knows that New Atheism is absolute nonsense. And I say this as someone who is sympathetic to atheism when it is intellectually credible. Philosophical atheism is intriguing and a very excellent field of study, and there are some brilliant atheist philosophers. But this new atheist movement, it's bad. And I fully agree with the statements of guys like Michael Ruse, who says that Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, makes me embarrassed to be an atheist. The arguments he uses would not pass an introductory philosophy of religion course. I fully agree with them. As atheists, we need to push back against new atheism. Like, if atheism is going to survive, new atheism has to die. And that is because it's so illiterate of the tradition it's dealing with that it's really just opens itself up for scrutiny and is absolutely ridiculous. So we're going to look at a couple arguments. Now, honestly, let's just preface this by saying, if you really need these arguments laid out, and when you hear them, if you need to know why they're bad, you might be a lost cause already. But if you're open to hearing about it, let's just go through some of the bad arguments. Now, I am an atheist, so I'm trying to combat bad arguments for my position, because that's more of what you have to do a lot of times is fight the misconception. So let's start off with one that Richard Dawkins uses as one of his main points, and Daniel Dennett's even used in his writing, which is surprising seeing he has a PhD in philosophy: the good old "who created God" argument, or the "who designed the designer." Haha. I love that they love to use that, especially when it comes to cosmological stuff. They're like, oh, everything that exists has a cause? Well, then God must have a cause. So this is an example of one of those arguments. If you need me to explain, if you need to watch the next minute or so of this video and hear me explain why this is a bad argument, go read some philosophy, because you should not need me to explain why this is a bad argument. Read any theist philosophy. I'm not a theist. In fact, I spend a lot of time trying to combat theism, but the tenets of what theism holds to, this is a complete straw man, of a complete unaware straw man of what theism actually teaches. So you can't say who created God, because, this is one of those things you hope you never have to explain. Take, for example, an Aristotelian argument from Act and Potency, where we reach the conclusion, such as an argument Edward Feser uses, where we reach the conclusion that God is pure actuality, containing no potentials, pure act. Pure act, by definition, cannot have a beginning. The infinite, by definition, cannot have a beginning. It cannot be created, or it is no longer God. Anything you posit as a next creator, it's an infinite regress, and you cannot have an infinite regress. It must terminate. When we're talking about essentially ordered causal series, which you can be skeptical if those exist, but when you're attacking theism, you can't use this argument. It's terrible, because it just shows a complete lack of understanding of contingency, necessity, because everything is contingent. There must be something ultimately necessary. So God is ultimately necessary. When something exists of necessity, it is not, by definition, it is not contingent on anything else for its existence. So who created God? God, by definition, part of his properties is that he cannot be created because of his necessity and his necessary nature. Anything that exists of necessity, saying this argument is essentially the logical equivalent or metaphysical equivalent of saying, well, then who created the number 2 or number 3 or number 4? Like numbers, logical proofs, these things exist of necessity. They're necessarily existent. Some of them logically, and God would be metaphysically, so there's a difference, but you get the analogy. Something that exists of necessity cannot have been created. So this is a really common and popular new atheist argument, but it's absolutely intellectually bankrupt. So if you ever use this argument or hear this argument, just disregard it. Anybody who uses this argument doesn't know anything about what they're talking about. God obviously doesn't need a creator because he is ultimately simple, as held to by classical theism. He exists of necessity. There are a plethora of metaphysical reasons that this is just completely an inept statement to make. Another atheist claim is like, well, you're all atheists about most gods. No. A libertarian or an American nationalist is not an anarchist about most governments. They just like the American. No, they're anarchists. They believe in no governments. Atheists believe in no gods. A monotheist believes in one. So you're not an atheist about other gods. You can't not believe in any gods about other gods. It's a completely illiterate statement. And then there are other arguments that are all just straw men. A straw man of religious tradition, which they obviously have no idea what they're talking about when it comes to religious tradition. They teach that, now we have science, which is in opposition to faith, which was traditionally held to by, say, we'll take Christianity, for example. Christianity was always lived on faith and was never, again, completely wrong. In the first century, Christian theologians like Gregory of Nyssa and Origen and St. Maximus the Confessor began developing philosophical systems for Christianity itself, and many scientists held the Christian belief, many philosophers. So these statements about faith and strawmanning religion as always coming out of blind faith is, again, just terrible, and you have to completely ignore the history of Christianity to accept these arguments. Another one is there's no evidence for God. Again, just really a stupid thing to say. We may say the arguments or the evidence is insufficient. We may say there is evidence, but it does not necessarily entail God. Like, for example, but the existence of the entire universe, given God exists, the hypothesis God exists, it would count as evidence. Naturalism has a tough time explaining sheer existence or consciousness, so there may be insufficiencies, and our epistemic probability may still be on the side of atheism, but still saying there's no evidence for God is ridiculous, because, again, you have to define what constitutes evidence, and there are a lot of things within the natural world that do constitute evidence for the supernatural, whether or not we accept that explanation, which I don't. Again, I like to say I'm a naturalist. I don't believe in any supernatural explanation about the universe. I just, as science disproves God. This is another one. Science. We have science now. We don't need God. Come on. Again, science is a field of study, a field of inquiry, a method of understanding the natural world. It does not posit metaphysics. So this is where it does not posit truths about metaphysics. This is another thing. This is the root of the new atheist ineptitude, and that is the rampant scientism, the belief that science is the only accurate or the penultimate means of knowledge. This again ignores the very obvious fact, anyone who knows anything about philosophy, that scientism is a philosophical presupposition. It requires a metaphysical presupposition, an axiom about the world. Presupposition is a better word. It requires a presupposition about the world, that it is only material, only natural. So there are metaphysical, or that our sense experience is an accurate way of deriving knowledge. So science, the practice of science, presupposes certain metaphysical claims to even be tenable. So when you're trying to posit that science can speak in areas of philosophy, it's completely wrong. So that's why we need metaphysics, and even us as non-theists who are dealing with these questions need to be well versed in the philosophical tradition we're dealing with. Other bad arguments, like if you only believe what you believe because that's where you grew up. I mean, again, that the way somebody got their beliefs has nothing to do with the truth validity of those beliefs. Blah blah blah. Flying spaghetti monster. I mean, ridiculous stuff like this. That they're saying, religious belief is equivalent to this ridiculous belief I'm positing, which is kind of a mix of a reductio ad absurdum and a straw man, when there's a long philosophical tradition of intricate properties of God and proofs for his existence that they are not dealing with and completely ignoring. So it's really born out of logical positivism, a theory of knowledge which asserted that only statements verifiable through empirical observation are meaningful. So starting with not a great philosophical system like logical positivism, which bleeds into, scientism. So science is the only objective means we can learn about the natural world. So again, there's scientist arguments, and then there's strawmans of religion, and then when they act like arguments against religion, act as arguments can be arguments against theism. Sam Harris does this. If you look it up, he has a quote where he says that an atheist is simply someone who has read the religious books and found their claims to be ridiculous, or the claim that they are divinely inspired to be ridiculous. If that quote doesn't show you how how uneducated of a statement that is, you're in trouble. Because, okay, I could be a philosophical theist or a deist or a pantheist and still be a theist and reject every religious claim to, divine inspiration or, scriptural reports. So an atheist is not someone who rejects religious claims. An atheist is someone who believes there are no gods. So it's, okay, look, this is something we have to combat, because atheism is going to die if this is its best. But luckily, the new atheist movement has created a revolution in Christian intellectual thought. So the theist philosophy is becoming stronger by the minute, and so is the atheist philosophy in response. So the new atheists are kind of disregarded as credible amongst any circle of philosophers, as they should be. This should hopefully just be an introduction to how terrible they are. Again, you shouldn't need me to tell you this. So if you've watched this entire video, thank you for the viewership, and I hope it's been enlightening, but hopefully it was more of just an exercise for fun. Some good sources: read Edward Fazer, although not everything he says is great, but read him. David Bentley Hart, Atheist Delusions, even some books by agnostics like Dave Berlinski, even arguments by atheists themselves, atheist philosophers. Real Atheology podcast, great atheist source. Atheism, The Basics, great book by Graham Oppy. Atheism and Agnosticism by Graham Oppy. Podcast with Graham Oppy. Oppy's like the best atheist philosopher in the world. Look him up. J.L. Mackie. Let's see, there's Quentin Smith, Michael Martin, again, Michael Ruse, I think I mentioned before, as some quotes against atheists, the new atheists. So you'll find any philosopher of merit is going to be highly critical of the new atheist and posit good reasons for being so. But yeah, so new atheism is something we have to kill, something that has to die if atheism is going to survive, and if we're going to be able to have any kind of meaningful, rational discourse about philosophy of religion. So yeah, that's just the introduction. New atheism is absolute garbage. Distance yourself from that. Distance yourself from the meme pages. On Instagram, any page that has atheist, usually any page that has atheist or skeptic or godless or heathen in their title name is going to be pretty garbage. But judge on merit, not on names. That's just what I've observed. But yeah, new atheism is rampant on the internet, rampant, and it has to die. It's nowhere in academia. It's nowhere in intellectual circles. There's no new atheist, really, philosophers who are big in philosophy of religion. I mean, the only one of the new atheist crowd that's good, I mean, not good, none of them are good, but a actual philosopher in terms of trained in philosophy is Dennett. As I mentioned earlier, he uses the who created God argument in one of his writing. You have a PhD in philosophy and use that argument, you have no excuse. Absolutely horrible and an intellectual insult to atheism as a belief. So, reject new atheism and read some real atheist philosophers. And yeah, have a good one.